What really is ETA, and how is it different from starting a business?
Essentially, ETA, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, is an alternative pathway to being an entrepreneur.
PPM say what's in the PPM?
The mechanics of what we talked about earlier in terms of the search phase and then the acquisition capital and how all the incentives work. But most importantly, within a PPM, there's a section on the principal's background, which basically means the searcher. It's the story. It's like, who are you? Why are you doing this? Why do you think you'll be successful? And that's the most important part, in my opinion, in the PPM. The other part that's important is like, what industries are you going to go after? Why do you think that makes sense? Why would there be a buyer business fit in those industries? Like, what is it from your background that would enable you to be able to translate your leadership into that industry and convince someone to sell their business to you from that? One thing that's interesting about me is that I grew up with a single mom who also happened to be blind.
Tell us, what kind of businesses are up for sale in the market? Is someone running the business? What's in it aside the salary for this person running the business? Is it just you earn a paycheck and then that's it? Hello, Ben. Welcome to the Tea Time Global Podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Daniel.
I can imagine it's been a packed summer for you.
It's been a lot of fun. I'm kind of a warm weather person by nature, so I grew up in Louisiana where it's pretty warm, and so summertime is my favorite season.
Give listeners an idea of who you are. Tell them about your personal background.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's great to be with you. I consider myself a facilitator and educator at heart. I grew up in a small community in North Louisiana. One thing that's interesting about me is that I grew up with a single mom who also happened to be blind. She lost her sight at the age of 21. So I learned a ton from her, just about her attitude in life, which was extremely positive, and just kind of like resilience and working through things. I had not been to a big city in terms of living in a big city. And my first job out of undergrad was at Enron in Houston. So that was quite an adventure.
Enron.
I mean, I was just like wide-eyed to, be living in Houston. That was a big deal.
Is it the Enron?
Yeah, Enron that went down in a blaze of glory. So that was quite an introduction to the business world. But I knew that I was really interested in finance at heart. And I had an opportunity to come to Fuqua to get my MBA after the Enron bankruptcy. So I really felt like Duke was a lifeline and a second opportunity, in terms of launching the business career. I stayed in the finance world after Fuqua and worked in investment banking for 8 years before returning to work at the school. And I think what I realized is that I am an investor and a people person. So those things are part of the work as an investment banker. But what I enjoyed the most was investing in people. And so I'm really grateful that what I get to do here at Duke is be a connector, a facilitator, and invest my time in helping people discover what it is that they want to pursue, what their calling is in terms of their work calling.
Yeah. And I like the fact that you mentioned you're a connector and a people person. And sometimes people underestimate the value of connection and you being a people person. But these are really valuable skills. But I want to dwell a little bit on that. Did you always wake up knowing, you mentioned finance, but did you ever think you'd probably get into entrepreneurship at any point in time? When you start your career from, let's say, Enron to, even you being senior vice president at Jeffries, did you ever think, oh, I'm into finance, I'm into investment banking, and at some point in time, I want to be an entrepreneur? Was that a thing for you?
I think I realized it pretty early in life, actually. My first entrepreneurial endeavor, we had these vending machines at school that sold candy bars, like your Snickers and Twix and Reese's cups for 50 cents. We've had some inflation since then. But at the gas station, they sold these smaller packets of candy, Lemon Heads, Red Hots, Jawbreakers, and I could buy them at the gas station for 10 cents. There was a gap in the market. Like this wasn't in the vending machine and people enjoyed the value prop of paying 25 cents for those. So I would ride my bike to the gas station, load up, take a little brown bag of these candies to school, sell them at 25 cents. and I was making money and it was fun. My mom got a call from the principal. He said, "Did you realize Ben is selling candy at school?" Um, I mentioned, she was really my hero in so many ways. She defended me. She said, "Well, is there a problem with this? Like, do people want the candy? Do you sell it at school? Is there a problem?" Anyway, so I feel like I'm an entrepreneur at heart. And the thing about being entrepreneurially minded is that you can do this regardless of the organization that you're working in. Whether you're working at Enron was voted like, the most innovative company like 7 years running or something. I say voted. I think it was like a Fortune magazine kind of thing. So really more promotional, but being entrepreneurially mindset, you can bring that whether you're in a large organization or whether you're in a startup of one or two people. And this will eventually tie into ETA as well, but my both sides of my family, my grandfathers were farmers, cattle ranchers, and in a sense, that's like running a small, medium-sized business. So I learned a lot about life and being a good business person from what my grandparents taught me and also what my mom kind of continued to reinforce in me. She was a storyteller. Those were some of the entrepreneurial roots, I guess, that maybe there was like a spark that kind of ignited. And I was like, this makes sense. I get it. And it's fun.
Yeah. So this is a great segue because I was trying to find out whether like anything in your childhood, maybe you saw someone start a business, which is why when you got to a point, you're like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. And at this point, I want to find out, like a lot of people ask, I hear the word ETA or I hear people talk about it, but like what really is ETA and how is it different from starting a business? Because people oftentimes would think the only way I can be an entrepreneur is if I start a business. What is it and how different is it from starting a business from scratch?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, essentially, ETA, Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition, is an alternative pathway to being an entrepreneur. So rather than starting from scratch, you are acquiring an existing business and then you're building upon that foundation that's already been established by another entrepreneur. But like as mentioned earlier, like being an innovator and entrepreneur and bringing entrepreneurial mindset to what you're doing does not require that you start something from scratch. You can do that within an existing business. In fact, like if you think about this from, the startup world where you realize there's an opportunity, there's a need in the marketplace, you validate that through a customer discovery process. And then eventually you get to the point where you have revenues and maybe profits. And then around that time, or maybe before that, they'll have what's called product market fit, right? So product market fit is a really big thing within the entrepreneurial process, but it's just one step. So the way I think about it, if your audience is really more startup oriented, I would describe ETA like one of the benefits is that you're acquiring a business that's already achieved product market fit. I mean, it's validated because there's revenues, there's cash flows, there is an existing product that customers need, and you're acquiring that, and then you get to bring your entrepreneurial mindset to innovating within that business, scaling it, growing it over time, leading that culture within the company, and then ultimately exiting. But some people find that they enjoy being operators in the ETA world. There can be some more evergreen type capital where you have the opportunity just to continue to run that business somewhat indefinitely.
What created that spark all of a sudden? Because 5 years ago, ETA was as big as it is now. What happened?
Right. Well, this started a, a long time ago, decades ago at Stanford. Irv Grousbeck is credited with developing the traditional search fund model. So it's not brand new, but to your point, it has become a lot more widely popular. I think the proliferation has happened as it has spread to all of the top 25-ish business schools. So if you're at one of the top 25 business schools, there's going to be some kind of defined effort around ETA, whether that's a course that you have at the school or if it's more student-led type programming. But you're going to be exposed to the idea of ETA at one of the top 25 business school programs. And what's driving that? I think that a realization for young entrepreneurs that this is a real path. And the thing that's made it a more visible and accessible pathway is institutional money coming into the space. So the returns over time, and this is articulated in the Stanford Search Fund study that they put out every 2 years, are pretty jaw-dropping, mid 30% IRR for traditional search investors. And that has attracted more and more institutional money. Investors are coming into it. And whether you're doing traditional search or self-funded search, it's a more accessible pathway. There are ways to visit with investors and connect with them through conferences, for example, which is something we might touch on later. But all these different factors have contributed to the elevation of ETA as this pathway to entrepreneurship.
Why would anybody think of selling their business if the business is already making money?
I mean, there could be several reasons. Probably the most common is just retirement. So there are many business owners that have poured their life into running and building a good business, and now it's time for them to retire. Maybe they haven't had the son or daughter that would be fit or have the desire to even run the business, and so there's not a family succession plan. And then maybe it's not the kind of business, or maybe they weren't the kind of leader to develop someone into, who would be a future business leader to carry on the legacy of their company. And therefore, it could be attractive to them to sell the business to a young professional, maybe someone who's graduating with their MBA or did so a few years ago. So that's one category. Now, it's not all of the people that are selling their businesses are looking to retire. It could be that they were an entrepreneur, they started a business, it's been successful, they've grown it to a certain level, and now they're just ready to exit and move on to something different. I mean, that can also be a reason why somebody's looking to sell to an ETA entrepreneur.
So at this point, we're speaking about why people will sell their business. I'm sure there's someone listening right now and says, if I want to be able to buy a business, how do I get started? Do I just where do I go to? Where are they selling the businesses? No, it would differ from market to market. The US ETA market will be very different from the African markets or the European markets, very different, even culturally. So if you can break it down for us, should someone start?
So maybe what I'll do is just talk about search at a very high level, the whole process, and then I'll zoom in to where to get started. So search at a very high level, you're going to have different phases. So the first phase is the search phase, and generally this is described as a 2-year process where you're either funded, like somebody is funding this search phase, or you're self-funded, meaning that no one's paying you a salary. You're just doing this on your own time and with your own resources during this 2-year phase, which you really need to be able to commit at least that amount of time to go find this kind of business and to close a deal. So the next phase is after the acquisition. Once you get the deal done, then you're in your operating phase. And this may be anywhere from, generally 4 to 8 years is a general range for what's typical for the operating phase. And at the end of the operating phase is when you exit the business. So exiting, is the final phase of the ETA process. That hopefully is a very happy day for the entrepreneur where they're able to exit and, get some strong returns for their investor and for themselves. So that's how the process works. In terms of where to get started, I would say that self-evaluation around what's the right path of ETA for you is really important. The buckets of the different pathways to ETA, I would describe as number one, traditional search. So I referenced this earlier as this traditional search model coming out of Stanford. And if I were to describe this pretty succinctly, I would say that in traditional search, it's a funded search. So you have limited partners, let's say 10 of them, and they're providing the search capital. They're going to provide the money for that 2-year phase. And whenever you bring the acquisition to the table, they're going to have the option, the right but not the obligation to fund the acquisition. That's going to require more money, in fact, a lot more money. So that would be putting in the acquisition capital at that point.
So in the first phase, which is, you mentioned that's their search phase, which is 2-year period, and you're providing the money. What's the money they're providing? What's the money for?
Yeah, if it's one person searching, and oftentimes in traditional search model, 2 people team up together and search as a pair, an operator pair. where one of them brings certain skill sets like operations expertise, and the other one brings certain skill sets like finance expertise. Um, and if it's, let's just say it's an individual searcher, so they're going to raise about $500,000, and this $500,000 is going to be used to fund the 2-year time frame of finding the business. What's the biggest expense? The biggest expense is the salary for the searcher. Yeah, so the searcher is going to get paid a market-based salary, that's an MBA in the zone of what MBA grads get paid for a base salary for these 2 years of searching for the business. And then the other expenses are going to be things like office rent expense, due diligence expenses like travel. Um, Searchers usually have a tech stack, so there's some tech resources that they're using to try to basically build their machine of running this search. Yeah, so that's the search phase and what the money goes to during the search phase. Would you like me to talk about the money for the acquisition capital?
Yes. So with the first phase, which is the search phase, the investor gives you money, say 1.5 million to go look for the business, and that goes into salaries, rent, like you've mentioned. So from there, now say you find the business, or let's even start. Let's say in that 2 years, you don't find the business. What happens? What happens in that 2 years? Before we get
Sure.
into
So
what happens when you find it.
statistically speaking, within the Stanford study, historically, about 2/3 of searchers successfully identify and acquire a company. So 2/3 of the time, in the traditional search model, the searcher is acquiring a business. 1/3 of the time, they do not. So what happens, like if you spend 2 years searching and you're not successful in acquiring a business, well, one, like you're no longer getting that salary. So you're out of a job. You basically fundraised for a 2-year process, and the goal was to acquire a company, and you didn't achieve that goal. But this happens to a fair amount of people, like 1/3 of those people. And when you hear their stories, it's pretty amazing for the people that don't acquire. I mean, nobody wants that outcome, but they are fully dedicated to achieving that outcome, and a lot of good things come from that effort. I mean, if you spend 2 years searching for a business, you're having a lot of conversations with a lot of business owners and investors because you're keeping your investors up to date. So those are strong skill sets to develop. Investors, they have a lot of opportunities where they're looking to plug in a a hungry professional. And so a lot of times people end up getting a job with one of the investors from their cap table. Sometimes they end up going to work for one of the companies that they were hunting, as a potential acquirer. But then that company decides, well, we're not ready to sell, but we'd love to bring you on as one of our chief leaders. So they go to do something like that. And then I've seen instances where someone discovers a need in the marketplace through their industry research and efforts for searching for business. And then they decide, hey, maybe this is just better to start from scratch. So they become, your traditional founder entrepreneur that creates a startup because of what they learned over the 2 years. So if it's one person, it would be 500,000. If it's two together, it'd be like 1 million of search capital. And basically what I'm saying is that not finding an acquisition is not the end of the world. The investors know that 1/3 of the searchers that they back are not going to find a deal. They view it as, I mean, obviously they want everyone to be successful in finding a deal, but they want to make sure it's the right deal. Right. Actually, the worst thing that can happen for the searcher is buying a business, but it turns out to be not a great business. And so they not only invest the 2 years in the search, but then they invest 5+ years in operations of something that just ends up not being a great investment. And then they've sunk 7 years of their time into something that's not a fruitful outcome. So that's actually, you as a searcher, you want to make sure that you're buying a business that will be a good one for you to operate.
So we're done with the first side. Like, let's go to the nice side. You do the 2 year search process, and then you find a business. What's the next step that the person goes through?
Sure. So it's like trial by fire, from what I understand, listening to a lot of these searcher stories. Immediately, you are the leader of the business. So, call out the CEO. Um, and now you're responsible for a business, for a set of employees. So real lives are impacted by your decisions, and not only your employees, but the customers that you serve. So whatever it is that the business is doing, you're going to have a set of customers, and those are you're now responsible for serving those customers. So there's a lot of responsibility that's suddenly thrust upon you. um, I hear searchers describe this as, just I think like just the stress and the gravity of that, that real lives are involved, and the people part of the business is what I've heard being described as the most challenging in terms of operating. But essentially, that's day one. Maybe it's like becoming a parent and, having a new child into the world, and your life changes all of a sudden. And then it's very gradual, right? Like how that moves over time. But then I've had operators share, that after running the business for, whether it's months or years, then that baby, they know that baby really well. And they've also helped to shape that culture, and they've built a business that they can call their own.
Before we get into exits, I know there are so many businesses that are up for sale. Can you tell us what kind of businesses are up for sale in the market?
Well, there's a lot of businesses up for sale. Not all of them are good. So, in terms of discerning what's a good business for an ETA acquisition versus what's probably a more challenging business for an ETA acquisition, I would say um, that having a business with a either recurring or predictable revenue is extremely valuable within an ETA acquisition. And that's because you're often using some debt in order to make the acquisition, to fund the capital. And if you're going to, finance a business with debt, you want to make sure that you have dependable cash flows. So you're going to need some recurring revenue or dependable revenue, and also strong margins. So those are the qualities or the characteristics that are fundamentally important in ETA acquisition. And when I say like strong margins, I would say, like 15% to 20% EBITDA is the profit metric that people are going to be looking at. So those are qualities that are important. And then I would say another way to think about these businesses are, who are the customers that they're serving? Are they serving commercial customers? Is it a B2B business, or is it a B2C business? Is it like residential services? A lot of services businesses are common within the ETA sphere. And then finally, I would say another way to think about these businesses is what's the workforce? So does the workforce consist primarily of blue collar workers, or of more white collar workers? That's another way to think about it.
Can you shed more light on the model in terms of how the investor benefits and also how the person running the business benefits?
Sure. So let's talk about incentives for the operator, and then also like what that looks like when it's time to sell the business, at the end of the operating phase. So the incentives are going to be different depending on which model you pursued. And we didn't unpack this too much at the beginning, but you don't have to do this as a traditional searcher. You can do this as a self-funded searcher. And one of the big differences between the two is that in traditional search, you are bringing in all of the equity for the deal is going to be outside equity. It's provided by those investors that invest in your search phase. So you're putting $0 in, but you are the entrepreneur that's leading the business, and you're going to have some incentives on the upside. Um, that incentive pool is typically 25% for an individual searcher, and that's going to be 25% of the upside if there's an extremely successful outcome. So $0 down, 25% of the upside in successful outcomes.
What's a successful outcome they are looking for?
Right. The way they define a successful outcome is based on an IRR threshold. So if your investors achieve an IRR in excess of a certain number, let's call it 30%, then you will achieve that 25% upside share. The 25% is actually split into three different tranches. The first tranche is received by the searcher at the time of the acquisition. The second tranche is time-based, and so it's usually over a 4-year operating period. So for that 4 years, as you're operating the business, you're earning those, think about it as like equity options, those equity options in the business. And then the third tranche is granted on the successful outcome with the investors receiving this IRR greater than, we're going to call it 30%. But these numbers are worked out in the fundraising process, and they're in your documentation. It's either based on an IRR threshold or on a cash multiple that you have achieved from the invested capital. But depending on the level of success of the outcome, sometimes operators have gone on to deploy that capital into other searchers. So they put on the investor hat and become investors themselves.
Great. So now let's look into the self-funded search model. Because personally, I did a mentor study with an ETA operator, and having conversations with him, for him, he looks at it as, I'm trying to build a family business. I don't intend selling this business. I want to expand it. So there are instances where an operator runs a business and says, I love this business. I want to expand it. I don't intend selling it. Can you walk us through how the self-funded search process looks like for people who say, I want to feel like an owner rather than just a CEO? How's the model like?
Sure. Yeah. So contrasting self-funded with traditional search, in the self-funded model, first of all, you don't draw a salary. So there's no one that's, funding a salary for you to do your 2-year search phase. So that means you're bootstrapping that. Sometimes I've seen self-funded searchers that are doing this on the side while they are continuing to work at another job. That can be very challenging, as you can imagine, as they would need to dedicate, the effort that's needed to hold down their full-time gig while doing this on the side. And others have different resources where, perhaps there's a spouse that has a full-time employment situation and the other spouse is dedicating their time to search. I've seen that before. But regardless, you're not drawing a salary, and you're going to have to fund your own diligence expenses. So think about the different professional service providers that you would need to involve in a diligence process, like the accounting diligence of the books, the legal diligence. You would be needing to hire an attorney. So these kinds of expenses you would be fronting yourself within the deal. So these are some of the considerations of going the self-funded way. The upside of being self-funded is that you get true autonomy and ownership. So you're not just the CEO, but you're the owner. So you're going to end up owning a controlling stake in this business, more than 50% of it if you go the self-funded route. You may bring in some minority investors to help you, meet the capital needs of acquiring the business, but you're still going to be the control owner. So the owner and the operator, contrasted with the traditional search model where you are the operator, but you are not the owner. Let's be clear. The investors that came in to back your search, they own the business. You just have some upside if things go extremely well, by the time of the exit.
So, and still talking about the self-funded search. So for someone who says, I want to do a self-funded search, but I do not have enough money to do it. Have you seen instances where maybe a couple of people come together to pool resources? Or what are the, I know there are other routes that people can go in terms of using the loan process. Can you shed more light on that process?
Sure. I mean, like, you can be really creative. There are ways to stage the diligence, for example, so that you're doing more of the work that doesn't cost as much money up front until you get further along and you have increased confidence level that you will close on the business, and therefore do some of the more expensive diligence at the end of that diligence phase. Um, Other ways of pooling resources, I mean, I think it's just like generally like ways of being scrappy, right? So, how much are you paying for your office rent? Or do you even have an office? Maybe you're just doing this virtually out of your home is probably what you're doing if you're self-funded. If you're a traditional investor, maybe you're like renting some WeWork kind of office space and that sort of thing. And then from the tech stack, I mean, there's just so many different options on the tech stack front, and a lot of it that you can do, um, very economically. So, yeah, some of it's just like, what kind of car are you choosing to drive as you're going through this process?
And I like the fact that you mentioned being scrappy, making sure that your expenses are at the minimum. So, what do you think there are particular skill sets that people who typically go, or there are traits that people who typically go through the ETA process have, like in your experience talking to different founders or operators? Like, have you seen that there's a particular trait that you speak to like 10 people and all of them have it? Like, what would it be? Same way people would say as an entrepreneur, you need to be a risk taker and all of that. Like, do you see maybe they are more analytical? What skill sets do you have? And the reason I ask this is for somebody who's listening and says, I want to do this, and the person's trying to take all the boxes and say, am I prepared for this process? What do you think will be the fundamental thing or skill set the person needs to develop?
Yeah, well, to kind of differentiate between like skill sets and qualities, in someone. So if we were to think about skill sets, I would say things like being able to source. So sourcing a deal is a key element of this. And, therefore like, building an efficient machine of outreach and follow up and being relentless on that is really important. I would say another skill set would obviously be in operating a business. So you've got to be not only good at sourcing the deal, but then all of the things that go into operations, like you would need to be good at, as well as a strong leader, because you're like leading and building the culture of the company. But as you think about like the qualities that someone might consider from a self-assessment standpoint, do they have? I would say that the three qualities that really stand out to me of searchers is that they have a strong desire for autonomy. Um, so both, as they search, but then also as they operate the business, maybe they just realize that like being in a large organization is just not for them. So this strong sense of, having some level of autonomy can be really compelling for some, and ETA is a great path for it. I think the other one is just if they want to bet on themselves. So they're willing to take that risk to bet on themselves because, as we've already discussed in this path, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. Like, you can dedicate 2 years to this and not end up with a business. You can buy a business that actually doesn't turn out to be that good as you thought it was going to be. And you invest 7 years of your life and don't have much to show for it. Um, but I think that for those that pursue this, they just have an innate desire to bet on themselves. And in this model, they get the opportunity to share in the upside of successful outcomes. And then I think the third quality that really stands out to me from people that pursue ETA is that they have a strong desire to impact their community. So they genuinely care about the employees of this business and about the community that they serve. So, who are those customers that they're serving? Um, and they have a deep care for that, and they want to make a difference in the lives of the people that work for the company and that are their customers.
And I like the fact that you mentioned that there's so many things that could go wrong, which is what brings me to my next question. What's the biggest challenges that people face either during their search process or the acquisition phase, or even during the operation phase, and or some misconceptions people have going into their business and they realize that, oh, this is different.
Sure, yeah. So, challenges that people face in a search process. I would say number one, that they wilt at the first roadblock that they hit in their deal because most deals that get done had 9 lives. I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong or, seem like basically like deal killers. The most deals die, and then the one that finally gets done comes back to life for one reason or another. So just like persevering, sticking with that. Um, I would say another challenge that people face in the acquisition process is falling in love with the business. So as they're doing their diligence, They become more and more in love with this deal, and they become blinded to some of the things that should be warning signs of not doing it. And so having that discernment is really key, because you're going to have to look past some things and have conviction if you ultimately get a deal done. But then at the same time, you're going to need to be attuned to being able to walk away when it's just not a good situation. And then finally, I would say that the biggest mistake that searchers make is that they don't keep competitive tension within their process and their pipeline going. So when they get under agreement for that deal and they're in the diligence phase, it's really easy to just focus on the diligence of that business and to stop the sourcing machine. But you got to keep the sourcing machine going, knowing that they say, usually it takes the third deal under LOI before you finally reach acquisition. So you want to keep your pipeline going, and that also gives you alternatives. I mean, we all want alternatives in life, right? So if you have good alternatives, that puts you in a better position to ultimately get your deal done.
Before we wrap up, so if there's somebody listening right now and is curious about starting the process within the next year, what does a person needs to do? Can you shed more light on the tools, books, podcasts that people can leverage to do a deeper dive into the ETA space?
Right. So, I mean, I think one great introduction to ETA is to go to one of the conferences. So at Duke, we have a
See that
collective
conference.
between Duke, UNC, UVA, and Georgetown. And so together, we put on the Southeast ETA conference each year, and we rotate which school's hosting it. This year, Darden at UVA will be hosting the Southeast ETA conference. And this is just a great opportunity.
Actually, this week. It's happening this week.
That's right. That's right. It's sorry. This Friday
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Saturday will be Southeast ETA. Daniel and I will be there. I and so it's a great community of people within the ETA ecosystem. You have searchers, operators, investors, and you get to hear from them on panels and really, just start to get into this dialogue and this flow. And then from there, I would say have like one-on-one, essentially like coffee chats with both searchers, operators, as well as investors. But this is the best way to just get infused into the ETA ecosystem. In terms of other resources, my favorite podcast is Acquiring Minds, hosted by Will Smith. And so I listen to this podcast regularly, but like find a way to integrate these things into your daily life or weekly life, just your rhythms of life. If you listen to podcasts and check out Acquiring Minds and listen to a few of these stories, and if it's fun to you, if it energizes you, if you like that, then that's probably a good sign that ETA could be for you. And it also, over time, like helps you to build your knowledge base of the space. Other resources and books, I mean, Buy Then Build by Walker Diebold is one that's referenced quite frequently. There's also How to Buy a Small Business, which is from Harvard, out of Harvard, and those are some of the book resources that are well known, as well as the Stanford, like on traditional search. Stanford puts out a traditional search primer, which is a really helpful resource for those that are getting up to speed on traditional search.
Great. So as a coach, when we have a guest on the podcast, there's a guest who came before you, who left a question for you. So we'd ask you that question. And also you have a chance to also ask the next guest, who you don't know who it will be, a question. But before we get into that, I want to ask, what's one piece of advice you'd leave for aspiring entrepreneurs who want to pursue ETA before we get into what question was left for you?
I think that I would say really spend the needed time on what you see as your purpose and how that aligns with how you're going to dedicate your time in your career or, to a business. And, the effort that you put into that can really pay off, because ultimately, if you wake up in the morning and you have a sense of purpose in what you're doing, you're going to be, I believe you're going to be pretty happy with what you're doing. So that would be my advice. You know, uh, pour into that self-reflection on what your purpose and calling is. Because if you're in the business world, you're going to be spending the majority of your awake hours dedicated to your career and your work. So, hopefully that is rewarding for you.
And now to the question that was left for you. Our previous guest asked, what's one thing that people don't know about you, even after they've spoken to you for the 10th time?
Okay, so I mean, I revealed some things pretty early on this. I feel like I have um, that I used some of my common bullets, like between growing up with a single blind mom and working at Enron as my first job. I guess the other thing I would say is that I am a huge sports fan. Um, I am not a great athlete. Uh,
That's a huge contrast.
and the one thing that I did catch on with as I was growing up was water skiing. So I was a competitive water skier in college and continued to enjoy um, uh, doing the slalom course on water skiing. So that's probably the one thing about me that not everybody knows.
Nice, nice. And I'm glad I had this on the podcast.
Oh, it was great to be a part of this, Daniel.
Yes.
Thank you
And
so
what's
much.
one question you want to leave for our next guest? Your question for the next guest.
Hmm. My question for the next guest is, what is the most important thing for you in your life?
What is the most important thing for you in your life? Thank you so much, Ben. It was a pleasure having this conversation on ETA, and I'm sure our listeners listening to this episode will get at least an insight into ETA, and also the resources that you've shared would help them get started. And for people who have already started their journey, my hope is that this will be the kick they need to hear to make them still pursue this ETA journey. Thank you so much, and really appreciate your time.
You're very welcome. Enjoyed it, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you.